The Book Thief, Part 2. I'd just like to say I don't speak German, so I'll try to sound the words out when I get to the German parts, but you'll have to forgive me. This is Arrival on Himmel Street. That last time, that red sky. How does a book thief end up kneeling and howling and flanked by a man-made heap of ridiculous, greasy, cooked-up rubble? Years earlier, the start was snow. The time had come for one. A spectacularly tragic moment. A train was moving quickly. It was packed with humans. A 6-year-old boy died in the third carriage. The book thief and her brother were traveling down toward Munich, where they would soon be given over to foster parents. We now know, of course, that the boy didn't make it. How it happened. There was an intense spurt of coughing, almost an inspired spurt, and soon after, nothing. When the coughing stopped, there was nothing but the nothingness of life moving on with a shuffle or a near silent twitch. A suddenness found its way into his lips then, which were a corroded brown color and peeling like old paint, in desperate need of redoing. Their mother was asleep. I entered the train. My feet stepped through the cluttered aisle, and my palm was over his mouth in an instant. No one noticed. The train galloped on, except the girl. With one eye open, one still in a dream, the book thief, also known as Liesel Meminger, could see without question that her younger brother Werner was now sideways and dead. His blue eyes stared at the floor, seeing nothing. Prior to waking up, the book thief was dreaming about the Führer, Adolf Hitler. In the dream, she was attending a rally at which he spoke, looking at the skull-colored part in his hair and the perfect square of his mustache. She was listening contentedly to the torrent of words spilling from his mouth. His sentences glowed in the light. In a quieter moment, he actually crouched down and smiled at her. She returned the smile and said, "Guten Tag, Herr Führer." Why, geht's dir gut? She hadn't learned to speak too well, or even to read, as she had rarely frequented school. The reason for that she would find out in due course. Just as the Führer was about to reply, she woke up. It was January 1939. She was 9 years old, soon to be 10. Her brother was dead. One eye open, one still in a dream. It would be better for a complete dream, I think, but I really have no control over that. The second eye jumped awake and she caught me out. No doubt about it. It was exactly when I knelt down and extracted his soul, holding it limply in my swollen arms. He warmed up soon after, but when I picked him up originally, the boy's spirit was soft and cold like ice cream. He started melting in my arms, then warming up completely, healing. For Liesel Meminger, there was the imprisoned stiffness of movement and the staggered onslaught of thoughts. Es stimmt nicht? This isn't happening. This isn't happening. And the shaking? Why do they always shake them? Yes, I know. I assume it has something to do with instinct, to stem the flow of truth. Her heart at that moment was slippery and hot and loud, so hot, so loud. Stupidly I stayed. I watched. Next, her mother. She woke her up with the same distraught shake. If you can't imagine it, think clumsy silence. Think bits and pieces of floating despair and drowning in a train. Snow had been falling consistently, and the service to Munich was forced to stop due to faulty track work. There was a woman wailing. A girl stood numbly next to her. In panic, the mother opened the door. She climbed down into the snow, holding the small body. What could the girl do but follow? As you've been informed, 2 guards also exited the train. They discussed and argued over what to do. The situation was unsavory, to say the least. It was eventually decided that all 3 of them should be taken to the next township and left there to sort things out. This time, the train limped through the Snowden country. It hobbled in and stopped. They stepped out onto the platform, the body in her mother's arms. They stood. The boy was getting heavy. Liesl had no idea where she was. All was white, and as they remained at the station, she could only stare at the faded lettering of the sign in front of her. For Liesl, the town was nameless, and it was there that her brother Werner was buried 2 days later. Witnesses included a priest and 2 shivering grave diggers. An observation. A pair of train guards, a pair of grave diggers. When it came down to it, one of them called the shots. The other did what he was told. The question is, what if the other is a lot more than one? Mistakes, mistakes. It's all I seem capable of at times. For 2 days, I went about my business. I traveled the globe, as always, handing souls to the conveyor belt of eternity. I watched them trundle passively on. Several times I warned myself that I should keep a good distance from the burial of Liesl Memminger's brother. I did not heed my advice. From miles away as I approached, I could already see the small group of humans standing frigidly among the wasteland of snow. The cemetery welcomed me like a friend, and soon I was with them. I bowed my head. Standing to Liesl's left, the gravediggers were rubbing their hands together and whining about the snow and the current digging conditions. So hard getting through all the ice and so forth. One of them couldn't have been more than 14, an apprentice. When he walked away after a few dozen paces, a black book fell innocuously from his coat pocket without his knowledge. A few minutes later, Liesl's mother started leaving with the priest. She was thanking him for his performance of the cemetery. The girl, however, stayed. Her knees entered the ground. Her moment had arrived. Still in disbelief, she started to dig. He couldn't be dead. He couldn't be dead. He couldn't. Within seconds, snow was carved into her skin. Frozen blood was caked across her hands. Somewhere in all the snow, she could see her broken heart in 2 pieces. Each half was glowing and beating under all that white. She realized her mother had come back for her only when she felt the boniness of a hand on her shoulder. She was being dragged away. A warm scream filled her throat. A small image, perhaps. 20 meters away, when the dragging was done, the mother and the girl stood and breathed. There was something black and rectangular lodged in the snow. Only the girl saw it. She bent down and picked it up and held it firmly in her fingers. The book had silver writing on it. They held hands. A final soaking farewell was let go of, and they turned and left the cemetery, looking back several times. As for me, I remained a few minutes longer. I waved. No one waved back. Mother and daughter vacated the cemetery and made their way toward the next train to Munich. Both were skinny and pale. Both had sores on their lips. Liesl noticed it in the dirty, fogged-up window of the train when they boarded just before midday. In the written words of the book thief herself, the journey continued like everything had happened. When the train pulled into the Bahnhof in Munich, the passengers slid out as if from a torn package. There were people of every stature among them. The poor were easily recognized. The impoverished always try to keep moving, as if relocating might help. They ignore the reality that a new version of the same old problem will be waiting at the end of the trip, the relative you cringe to kiss. I think her mother knew this quite well. She wasn't delivering her children to the higher echelons of Munich, but a foster home had apparently been found, and if nothing else, the new family could at least feed the girl and the boy a little better and educate them properly. The boy. Liesl was sure her mother carried the memory of him, slung over her shoulder. She dropped him. She saw his feet and legs and body slap the platform. How could that woman walk? How could she move? That's the sort of thing I'll never know or comprehend, what humans were capable of. She picked him up and continued walking, the girl clinging now to her side. Authorities were met, and questions of lateness and the boy raised their vulnerable heads. Liesl remained in the corner of the small, dusty office as her mother sat with clenched thoughts on a very hard chair. There was the chaos of goodbye. It was goodbye that was wet, with the girl's head buried into the woolly worn shallows of her mother's coat. There had been some more dragging. Quite a way beyond the outskirts of Munich, there was a town called Molching, said best by the likes of you and me as Molking. That's where they were taking her, to a street by the name of Himmel. A translation. Himmel means heaven. Whoever named Himmel Street certainly had a healthy sense of irony. Not that it was a living hell, it wasn't. But it sure as hell wasn't heaven either. Regardless, Liesel's foster parents were waiting. The Hubermans. They'd been expecting a girl and a boy, and would be paid a small allowance for having them. Nobody wanted to be the one to tell Rosa Huberman that the boy didn't survive the trip. In fact, no one ever really wanted to tell her anything. As far as dispositions goes, hers really wasn't enviable, although she had a good record with foster kids in the past. Apparently, she'd straightened out a few. For Liesel, it was a ride in a car. She'd never been in one before. There was the constant rise and fall of her stomach, and the futile hopes that they'd lose their way or change their minds. Among it all, her thoughts couldn't help turning toward her mother back at the Bahnhof, waiting to leave again. Shivering, bundled up in that useless coat. She'd been eating her nails, waiting for the train. The platform would be long and uncomfortable, a slice of cold cement. Would she keep an eye out for the approximate burial site of her son on the return trip, or would sleep be too heavy? The car moved on, with Liesel dreading the last lethal turn. The day was gray, the color of Europe. Curtains of rain were drawn around the car. Nearly there, the foster care lady, Frau Henrik, turned around and smiled. "Dein neues Heim? Your new home." Liesel made a clear circle on the dribbled glass and looked out. A photo of Himmel Street. The buildings appear to be glued together, mostly small houses and apartment blocks that look nervous. There is murky snow spread out like carpet. There is concrete, empty hat stand trees, and gray air. A man was also in the car. He remained with the girl while Frau Henrik disappeared inside. He never spoke. Liesel assumed he was there to make sure she wouldn't run away, or to force her inside if she gave them any trouble. Later, however, when the trouble did start, he simply sat there and watched. Perhaps he was only the last resort, the final solution. After a few minutes, a very tall man came out. Hans Huberman, Liesel's foster father. On one side of him was the medium-height Frau Henrik. On the other side was the squat shape of Rosa Huberman, who looked like a small wardrobe with a coat thrown over it. There was a distinct waddle to her walk. Almost cute if it wasn't for her face, which was like creased-up cardboard and annoyed, as if she were merely tolerating all of it. Her husband walked straight, with a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. He rolled his own. The fact was this. Liesel would not get out of the car. "Was ist los mit dem Kind?" Rosa Huberman inquired. She said it again. "What's wrong with this child?" She stuck her face inside the car and said, "Nein, come, come." The seat in front was flung forward. A corridor of cold light invited her out. She would not move. Outside, through the circle she'd made, Lisa could see the tall man's fingers, still holding the cigarette. Ash stumbled from its edge and lunged and lifted several times until it hit the ground. It took nearly 15 minutes to coax her from the car, and it was the tall man who did it, quietly. There was the gate next, which she clung to. A gang of tears trudged from her eyes as she held on and refused to go inside. People started to gather on the street until Rosa Huberman swore at them, after which they reversed back whence they came. A translation of Rosa Huberman's announcement. "What are you assholes looking at?" Eventually, Liesel Memminger walked gingerly inside. Hans Huberman had her by one hand. Her small suitcase had her by the other. Buried beneath the folded layer of clothes in that suitcase was a small black book, which, for all we know, a 14-year-old gravedigger in a nameless town had probably spent the last few hours looking for. "I promise you," I imagine him saying to his boss, "I have no idea what happened to it. I've looked everywhere, everywhere." I'm sure he would never have suspected the girl, and yet there it was, a black book with silver words written against the ceiling of her clothes. The Grave Digger's Handbook, a 12-step guide to grave digging success, published by the Barron Cemetery Association. The book thief had struck for the first time, the beginning of an illustrious career. Yes, an illustrious career. I should hasten to admit, however, that there was a considerable hiatus between the first stolen book and the second. Another noteworthy point is that the first was stolen from snow and the second from fire. Not to omit that others were also given to her. All told, she owned 14 books, but she saw her story as being made up predominantly of 10 of them. Of those 10, 6 were stolen. 1 showed up at the kitchen table, 2 were made for her by a hidden Jew, and 1 was delivered by a soft yellow-dressed afternoon. When she came to write her story, she would wonder exactly when the books and the words started to mean not just something, but everything. Was it when she first set eyes on the room with shelves and shelves of them? Or when Max Vandenberg arrived on Himmel Street carrying handfuls of suffering and Hitler's Mein Kampf? Was it reading in the shelters? The last parade to Dachau? Was it the word shaker? Perhaps there would never be a precise answer as to when and where it occurred. In any case, that's getting ahead of myself. Before we make it to any of that, we first need to tour Liesl Meminger's beginnings on Himmel Street in the art of Sausmensching. I don't know what that means. Upon her arrival, you could see the bite marks of snow on her hands and the frosty blood on her fingers. Everything about her was undernourished. Wire-like shins, coat hanger arms. She did not produce it easily, but when it came, she had a starving smile. Her hair was a close enough brand of German blonde, but she had dangerous eyes, dark brown. You didn't really want brown eyes in Germany around that time. Perhaps she received them from her father, but she had no way of knowing, as she couldn't remember him. There was really only one thing she knew about her father. It was a label she did not understand. A strange word. Communist. She'd heard it several times in the past few years. Communist? There were boarding houses crammed with people, rooms filled with questions, and that word. That strange word was always there somewhere, standing in the corner, watching from the dark. It wore suits, uniforms. No matter where they went, there it was, each time her father was mentioned. She could smell it and taste it. She just couldn't spell or understand it. When she asked her mother what it meant, she was told that it wasn't important, that she shouldn't worry about such things. At one boarding house, there was a healthier woman who tried to teach the children to write, using charcoal on the wall. Liesl was tempted to ask her the meaning, but it never eventuated. One day, that woman was taken away for questioning. She didn't come back. When Liesl arrived in Molking, she had at least some inkling that she was being saved, but that was not a comfort. If her mother loved her, why leave her on someone else's doorstep? Why? 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 The fact that she knew the answer, if only at the most basic level, seemed beside the point. Her mother was constantly sick, and there was never enough money to fix her. Liesl knew that, but that didn't mean she had to accept it. No matter how many times she was told that she was loved, there was no recognition that the proof was in the abandonment. Nothing changed the fact that she was a lost, skinny child in another foreign place with more foreign people alone. The Hubermans lived in one of the small box-like houses on Himmel Street. A few rooms, a kitchen, and a shared outhouse with neighbors. The roof was flat, and there was a shallow basement for storage. It was supposedly not a basement of adequate depth. In 1939, this wasn't a problem. Later, in 42 and 43, it was. When air raids started, they always needed to rush down the street to a better shelter. In the beginning, it was the profanity that made an immediate impact. It was so venomous and prolific. Every second word was either shout, smench, or sacral, or arschlock. For people who aren't familiar with these words, I should explain. Sow, of course, refers to pigs. In the case of Schaumensch, it serves to castigate, berate, or plain humiliate a female. Saukurl, pronounced Sockerl, is for a male. Arschlock can be translated directly into asshole. That word, however, does not differentiate between the sexes. It simply is. Liesel's foster mother shouted that first evening when she refused to have a bath. "You filthy pig! Why won't you get undressed?" She was good at being furious. In fact, you could say that Rosa Huberman had a face decorated with constant fury. That was how the creases were made in the cardboard texture of her complexion. Liesel naturally was bathed in anxiety. There was no way she was getting into any bath, or into bed for that matter. She was twisted into one corner of the closet-like washroom, clutching for the non-existent arms of the wall for some level of support. There was nothing but dry paint, difficult breath, and the deluge of abuse from Rosa. "Leave her alone." Hans Huberman entered the fray. His gentle voice made its way in, as if slipping through a crowd. "Leave her to me." He moved closer and sat on the floor against the wall. The tiles were cold and unkind. "You know how to roll a cigarette?" he asked her. And for the next hour or so, they sat in the rising pool of darkness, playing with the tobacco and the cigarette papers, and Hans Huberman smoking them. When the hour was up, Liesel could roll the cigarette moderately well. She still didn't have a bath. Some facts about Hans Huberman. He loved to smoke. The main thing he enjoyed about smoking was the rolling. He was a painter by trade and played the piano accordion. This came in handy, especially in winter, when he could make a little money playing in the pubs of Mulking, like the Knoller. He had already cheated me in one world war, but would later be put into another, as a perverse kind of reward, where he would somehow manage to avoid me again. To most people, Hans Huberman was barely visible. An unspecial person. Certainly his painting skills were excellent. His musical ability was better than average. Somehow, though, and I'm sure you've met people like this, he was able to appear as merely part of the background. Even if he was standing at the front of a line, he was always just there. Not noticeable, not important, or particularly valuable. The frustration of that appearance, as you can imagine, was in its complete misleadance, let's say. There most definitely was value in him, and it did not go unnoticed by Liesel Meminger, the human child, so much cannier at times than the stupefyingly ponderous adult. She saw it immediately. His manner, the quiet air around him. When he turned the light on in the small, callous washroom that night, Liesel observed the strangeness of her foster father's eyes. They were made of kindness and silver, like soft silver melting. Liesel, upon seeing those eyes, understood that Hans Huberman was worth a lot. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that for right now, and please subscribe so you will be able to follow me through the rest of the book. Thank you.